Welcome to Contrary Research Radio, the podcast that dives deep into the world's most interesting private tech companies. I'm Kyle Harrison, general partner at Contrary, and today we're joined by Jonathon Barkl, CEO and founder of AirGarage. As anyone who's had the pleasure of pulling their own hair out trying to find a parking spot in a crowded city or on a busy weekday will tell you, parking can be a nightmare. But it also happens to be big business. It might be even bigger business than you realize. There are between 700 million and 2 billion parking spaces in the United States, which would mean upwards of 7 for every car that's on the road. About a third of the average American city is made up of parking. Despite the size of the parking universe, parking management is still this fragmented, old-school industry. There's a few big players. They've been around almost as long as cars have been on the road. Part of the problem is that the average owner of a parking lot or a parking garage is unlikely to think of that parking space as their main business, and they're probably not getting as much value out of their asset as they could. AirGarage is trying to solve this sneaky big problem. Founded in 2017 by Jonathon Barkl, Chelsea Boarder, and Scott Fitzsimmons, the company started as a kind of Airbnb for parking lots. It helped homeowners rent out their driveways to college students sick of paying exorbitant fees for on-campus parking. Since then, it has evolved a lot. It's become a full-stack parking management platform, which leverages software in order to handle everything from payment collection, enforcement, marketing, you name it. So to help us dig into what makes AirGarage work, we're joined by Jonathon Barkl, co-founder and CEO of AirGarage. All right, Jonathon, awesome to have you here. Thanks for taking the time to do this. I'm excited about the conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Well, listen, this is one of those things, I'm excited to get to sort of have you to unpack the story, because this is one of those things that I think about a lot, where you have these sort of categories that really make the world run, but most people just don't think about them very much, elevators, utility poles, parking lots. But each time I dig into one of those kinds of categories, I'm always just totally blown away, because you realize that it's like, man, even you take, managing parking, it's $5+ billion of revenue goes towards managing this parking, and it's a $20 billion plus, maybe billions more, just the wasted resources and energy and management and all of these things. So obviously you found this very sort of sneaky big problem. Walk me through how you landed on parking and why this is sort of the problem this sort of sneaky big problem that you're tackling.
Yeah, no, it's a great description you just gave of, parking as one of these industries that nobody really thinks about, even though it touches all of our lives every single day. It's funny you mentioned elevators, because I've been thinking a lot lately about this like oligopoly in the elevator industry of like Schindler and Otis. Like next time you get in an elevator, just pay attention to what is the name on the nameplate. And it's like usually one of those two companies. And elevators, we have a lot of elevators and parking garages that we manage, and they're constantly broken. And my conspiracy is like they prefer that they're broken, because that's how they make more money, is by sending out vendors to service things, right?
So funny.
And it's actually funny. That's very similar to the parking industry. Is, for a long time, vendors in the parking market have been very interested in this model of let's sell you hardware, and like, it doesn't necessarily need to last for a long time, because the way we're going to make money is we're going to, service it for you, and we're going to make a lot of money doing that. So, we didn't necessarily come at parking from that angle. I think we came at it from the angle that most people come at it from, which is that parking as a consumer in the 2020s it's just still terrible as an experience, right? It's kind of amazing. Like if you think about parking day to day, I think for a lot of people, especially if you live in a relatively dense city, parking affects your decision making and your behavior on a daily basis, right? I'll be thinking like, hey, I want to go to, out onto the town and like meet up with a friend and go to a restaurant or go to a bar. And one of the first things I have to think about is there parking near there? How easy is the street parking in that neighborhood? Like, am I going to be able to find a garage spot? Like all these sorts of things that affect, therefore, like where I go and how I spend my time. And it's just, how can you make a better experience? So to answer your actual question, we came at it from that angle as consumers. And when we were consumers, we were actually students at the time. So Scott, Chelsea, and I met at Arizona State University. Those are my co-founders. And we all sort of had this problem as students that parking on campus near the university obviously is very expensive. It, isn't very easy to find a space. And even if you do find a space and you get a permit, the university has really terrible systems for booking it. And then also, when they have football games, they kick you out of your space so that they can make more revenue from football games. And so we sort of saw that problem and started thinking about like, what ways could you solve this, because it's really just a supply and demand problem. And originally the way we did that was literally by starting what we call now, we refer to it lovingly as like AirGarage 1.0, but it was just going door to door in neighborhoods near the university and knocking on people's doors and seeing if they would rent out driveway spaces to us. And we've come a long way since then. Like we manage, massive parking garages and parking lots in downtown urban areas. It's not at all driveways anymore, but it's sort of that common thread from then to now is like there's this misallocation of parking real estate in urban areas. And we had identified that at the beginning from driveways. And now we've realized, wow, there's an even bigger problem, which is, 30% of the average American city that is dedicated to parking and parking real estate and using, that real estate for car storage. But it's just woefully mismanaged, underutilized, not digitized in any way, shape, or form. And so we're working on how do you take that real estate and put it online for the first time.
I love that. It's also like, there's not a day goes by that I have to park my car that I don't think about like Ant-Man technology, where I wish I could just shrink my car and stick it in my pocket because it's such a terrible experience.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. It's interesting, like maybe walk me through, and because I want to dig into this, because what's really interesting is that not only is parking this sort of like invisible problem that a lot of people don't think about, it's also a very multimodal, sort of multifaceted problem that you have to solve. There's lots of different, it's sort of, you talk a lot about like in restaurants, you have sort of the sort of front of the house, in the restaurant, back of the house, whatever systems. But parking garages are actually fairly similar. Like there's a lot of complex pieces. So maybe diving into this, right? So to talk to me about the AirGarage product today, kind of lay it out, and then maybe we can double click into some of the decisions that you made there.
Yeah, and I think that what you just highlighted there is the reason that parking today fundamentally hasn't changed much. While, basically everything around us since the 1990s has fundamentally changed because of technology, because of the internet. And the reason parking hasn't is because it's this, like you said, multifaceted, very deep problem that you have to solve. And what I mean by that is like the parking industry, if you sort of look at like a high level industry overview, it's like the bottom layer of sort of this cake of the parking industry is the real estate asset owner, right? Like somebody that actually owns the physical real estate. Typically what they do is they will hire a parking management company, also known as like a parking operator. That's the next layer of the cake. You can think of that as like literally just like a property management company, but for parking, right? And those companies that have been around for 50 or 100 years, they, have been doing things more or less the same way since the 1980s. They install a, gate arm machine to collect payments. They hire an attendant. They collect cash. They do whatever. It's all on paper. It's not automated, whatever. And in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of people that are like software entrepreneurs and coming into this industry and sort of having the same pain points that we had of parking just sucks as an experience, and thinking to themselves like, wow, this is such an old school backwards industry. We can fix it because we know how to write software. And so we're going to do that. And what they inevitably do is they become this layer on top of that cake and sort of like Band-Aid on top of that, where basically they say, we can build this software, but it'd be really difficult to distribute it directly to the real estate owners. So let's go distribute it to the parking operators, the parking management companies, because they already have all the contracts with the real estate. And so we'll just sell technology to them to enable them to do their stuff more effectively and hopefully transform the industry in the process. But, our opinion and our thesis is basically that like you cannot do that. That doesn't work. You can't sell technology to these old school operators and actually expect them to embrace it because they're, duct taping together 5 different technology systems. They have a payment machine from one company, an app from a different company, a back-end, analytics system from a different company, and they're expected to duct tape all this together. But again, this company is 50 or 100 years old, and they're paying like $30,000, a year frontline, on the ground employees to try to stitch this together. It just doesn't really work and isn't integrated. And so our thesis has always been, you need to build the software and build the technology and use that to outcompete the old school operators at their own game. So we go directly to the real estate owner, and that means that we both have to be an operating company and a software business, which a lot of software companies just aren't willing to do, right? They don't want to get their hands dirty. They don't want to spend time in parking lots. I spend probably more time in parking lots than I do in our office, and I spend more time in parking lots of our competitors than they do in their own parking lots, right? Like I'm constantly in parking lots, and that's one of the important things that we do. And so what I mean by all of that is AirGarage is this sort of like full stack parking system and solution, right? So we're both the parking operator management company and the technology company. And those two things need to go hand in hand for this to really succeed, where we build all our own software. So we collect all the payments from drivers. We advertise the spaces across all the listing platforms. We do real-time dynamic pricing. We do license plate reading cameras. We do, have enforcement software and like a dashboard for owners, all of that. And then we also do all of the operations. So we sweep the locations, we pick up the trash, we plow the snow, we do the enforcement, we immobilize cars, we boot cars, we tow cars. We do everything involved in taking it from being just a piece of asphalt with stripes on it to a full-fledged parking operation that generates income, both on the technology side and on the operations side.
Wow. So if I unpack that and think about it, so basically the sort of old school model, like there's this even other layer, like not even just the technology layers that exist in a traditional parking garage, but there's also typically this management company, right? There is sort of the real estate asset owner, but they're usually paying a management company to keep track of everything, and then they're layering on technology. You guys have taken it a step further. Really, truly, I mean, the only thing left for you to do is to own the real estate and own the parking garages yourself. You've gone completely vertically integrated where you're actually the management company, and then you're implementing all of this technology. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We are both the management company and the technology company, just doing everything for the owner. And we really don't buy technology from any third parties, which is very different from a traditional management company where the owner hires them and then they're buying their app, their website, their analytics, their different products from a third party and bringing that in and then trying to sort of make it all one cohesive system.
Right. So, and walk me through too, because I think like one of these things that is so common in vertical market software, a lot of people think of it as like, hey, like, I build software for garage door repair service providers and it's a guy with a truck. And the reality is like, there's tons of guys with trucks for sure, but there are also these massive enterprise fleets that have 50, 100 trucks that they dispatch at different jobs, and they're managing, garage doors for warehouses as much as they are houses or whatever. Even in these sort of like quote unquote SMB verticals, you have a broad swath of different types of companies. And so in parking, like, are there sort of these similar, almost like oligopolies you talked about in elevators, where there are a few asset owners that own a huge portion of the garages that you've probably been in? Or is it it's one of these ridiculously fragmented markets where there's really no big player, if you will?
Yeah, it's definitely more on the fragmented side. I think parking is really interesting for that reason, where most real estate owners, especially before the last like 10 or so years, most real estate owners really only ever thought about parking as like an ancillary sort of nice to have or add on to their core business, right? Like they own an office building, they have a parking garage that their tenants park in. They own a retail center, they have a parking lot that the customers are coming to and parking in. It's like not the core business. And what that means is that most real estate owners, especially even ones that we talk to day to day, most real estate owners don't identify as parking lot or parking garage owners. They identify as I own office buildings or I own retail centers. Oh, and yeah, I guess I also own parking. But it's never like, I identify as a parking owner. And so the statistic that we've seen is something like 55 to 60% of the parking real estate in America supposedly is owned by more like mom and pops. And when I say mom and pops, I don't even mean like SMBs. I mean more like literally like your uncle bought a parking lot in 1970, and passed it down to you when he passed away, and like you happen to own a parking lot, but like you have a full-time job. You would never identify as a parking lot owner on any like statistical survey. You just happen to own this piece of real estate, the same as if you just happen to own like a duplex or a fourplex or whatever for passive income. And then 40 to 45% of the parking real estate is owned by more like institutional investors across the country. And that is shifting in favor of the institutions as this sort of urban infill trend has been happening over the last 10 or 15 years, where people are coming back into cities, investors are buying back the parking lots and parking garages in downtown areas from these mom and pops. And the mom and pops generally bought in like in the 80s and 90s when downtowns were sort of out of fashion and crime ridden and drug ridden supposedly. And so these people were able to buy in for cheap. And now that's kind of like transitioning back to the larger owners. But even still, most large asset owners don't think of themselves as parking owners. They think of themselves as office owners or retail owners or whatever you happen to have. And then they also happen to own parking. And so there are large owners of parking as a result of that, because they happen to own, $100 billion worth of office buildings. And so therefore they also own a significant amount of parking. But generally it's not, for the most part, people going and executing on a strategy to buy up parking real estate specifically. Although I think that there's a lot of opportunity in that, and we've started to see some people pick up on that thread and go after a little bit more, which we're excited about.
Yeah. So that's a big, I mean, it's a big challenge to undertake when you have this really fragmented market, especially when it is sort of an afterthought, right? You sort of have to find a way to get in touch with these real estate owners, not necessarily people who are eating and sleeping and breathing parking lots and strategy there and stuff. And so maybe start from the beginning. I want to get into the product and understand the technology piece, but even from the very beginning, you have to go to one of these folks and convince them that you should become their parking management company. How complicated is that? How much pushback is there? Are there sort of blue chip parking lot management companies out there that you have to beat out, or what is that conversation like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, there definitely are blue chip parking lot management companies out there that we had to beat out, right? Sort of the national names that people may be familiar with. There's like something like SP Plus, which is basically the only publicly traded parking management company. They also do a lot of other things, but SP Plus, if you've heard of ABM, which does building services, they also have a parking sort of arm. Laz Parking is a really big one. It's privately held. Ace Parking is pretty large. There's a lot of different parking businesses out there. And, to be honest, that kind of scared us out of diving right into the market in the beginning. I mean, we, like I said earlier, we started with driveway rentals, right? Literally like a peer-to-peer marketplace for driveways. It was like Airbnb for parking, right? And we worked on that probably for about a year before realizing that, like, hey, you can't really build a business on this. If we only make like $50 a month renting out each space and we only take 10%, we get $5 a month per space. Like, you need millions of spaces to scale this to any meaningful size. And, it just won't sustain a door-to-door sales force. Like, I was literally going door to door in the Phoenix heat, knocking on people's doors and saying, hey, would you rent out your driveway to a student? But you can't do that for $5 a month per spot, right? And so in middle of 2018, we actually started talking to our first sort of real parking lot, where it was this church that they had been selling parking for 30 plus years. And the way that they would do it is they would just hire some guy to sit there from, like 5 a.m. to 12 p.m. And another guy would sit there 12 to 7. And he would sit there and he would take $10 flat rate cash from you, give you a little raffle ticket to denote that you'd paid, and then you would be on your way. And so that worked for them for a long time. But I think them and a lot of other businesses 5 years ago started feeling sort of this labor crunch where they couldn't get somebody to, take that role and actually be there consistently. And so we happened to start talking to them right around this fortuitous time where they had this hair on fire problem of they actually kept hiring people. This church, they would hire people to sit there and they would stay for about a week and then they would disappear with the cash. And so for a church, that was obviously devastating because they were making like $4,000 a week from their parking lot, and that was all of the money they were using to fund their programs. And so we started working with them basically hand in hand through May of 2018 to co-create what AirGarage is today. Because before that point, we only rented out driveways. We were just a marketplace. We were just listing. We were not doing any of the operations. And thankfully, we worked with them basically to create what AirGarage is. So doing the advertising, installing signage, doing the enforcement, taking care of the parking lot, doing everything involved in it. And they were basically willing to take a bet on us and, go based on the reputation that we built with some other churches on our old platform and help us develop what does it take to actually run a parking lot. And then basically we spent 2018 and 2019 actually focused on that sort of thesis of like going after churches, businesses, hotels, locations that they own a parking lot, but it's not necessarily their core business, and trying to work with those folks. And at the time, really, it was because we didn't think that tier one sort of quote unquote real estate owners would want to work with a small startup, because like if they're working with SP Plus or Laz, why would they trust a small startup with their revenue that they're already making? So we thought we had to go after this market to create sort of found income for these people and open up underutilized spaces. And in retrospect, that was actually really good for us because it was a good training ground where we would take churches from making $0 a month to making $10,000 a month. And so if our system went down for a day, they wouldn't really care that much because they're like, well, we were making 0 6 months ago and now we're making 10,000, and like, we lost a day of revenue, but like still like net, we're up pretty well.
Yeah.
And then basically actually the funny thing is in 2020, COVID was one of the best things that happened to AirGarage. Our revenue actually dropped 90% from the first week of March to the fourth week of March in 2020, which was devastating at the time. But a few months later, what we started seeing was actually these tier one real estate owners starting to reach out to us and saying, hey, I've been working with SP Plus for 20 years and I'd like to basically work with AirGarage instead. And we were kind of like looking at them like, are you sure? Like, do you know who we are? Like, we're just this tiny little startup. And so we realized that SP Plus and a lot of these other big companies were sort of, having a really tough time during COVID. And it gave us an opportunity to realize that, we could work with these tier one owners and they would work with us. And they were a lot easier to sell to than these ancillary use cases where they knew what parking was, they knew why they wanted to make money, and they just wanted to do it better and have better technology and have better reporting and make more money. And so we started selling to those people, and that actually is where the business really took off, was selling to these real estate owners and realizing that they are not necessarily happy with the status quo like we thought that they were. They're not necessarily happy with the blue chip companies that are out there like we thought they were. And there was a lot of opportunity to bring technology into the market, and they were excited about that because they knew it would make them more money.
That's a really good segue, because it makes a ton of sense. We had to kind of go through this exploration. COVID was this really opportune moment. Probably even I would say like there were a number of industries that experienced like, hey, this is sort of the first like pause we've had in a long time, and it gives us this opportunity to reflect and think like, how could we be better in general that we didn't have before, because it was just so much hustle and bustle and day to day. So that sort of inflection point makes a ton of sense. The product is really interesting. I've had the chance to invest in companies like Toast in the past, and you see these things where they have a really core system. They're sort of doing a very specific part of POS or whatever, and then over time, the pitch is that we can say, hey, we can do more for a restaurant, right? It's scheduling. We can add on scheduling eventually or whatever, and that's something Toast has done. But it took them years to do that before they really moved away from their core. Something that is unique about you guys, and you have this great graphic that we were able to include in our research memo, where it sort of shows, hey, here's the sort of technology stack that exists in a normal parking garage. AirGarage is doing it all. Like, here's why we want to bring this unified, all-in-one platform. Why take that approach? Why not sort of, hey, we can become your management company, and then we'll become your billing, and that's the most important and kind of the gateway drug product, if you will, and then we can eventually expand. Why run it the entire stack all at once?
Yeah, I think that it's a fair point. Like, I don't know what was necessarily the correct answer. Like, it's possible that we could have gotten to market faster if we just went and said, oh, we're just going to be basically an old school parking operator from the beginning. But instead, we very much took sort of the Apple walled garden approach from the beginning, and actually the reason we started doing that was because every time we would try to outsource something, in our technology stack, we would always inevitably wind up being disappointed. So I remember at the very beginning, like I mentioned, a lot of software companies don't want to necessarily take on the operations, right? And we at the beginning were in the same mindset. We were like, oh, well, we're just going to be this software company, because before we'd been doing this marketplace. We were just going to be this software company. Like, we don't really want to do the dirty work here. Yeah. And so we tried to actually, in literally the first month, outsource enforcement of our first parking lot to some third party, and they just totally bungled it. And so we were like, well, okay, like we can't trust anybody like we can trust ourselves. And so we will just do this ourselves, and had it like forced us to be creative to figure out how can we tackle this. And that was actually what the genesis of the Space Force, which is our enforcement team, was forced through that. It's like the constraint of not being able to rely on anybody has forced us to develop a lot more sophisticated technology that is integrated very deeply, so that then like everything flows into one place. And that foundation is like what we now have been able to build on top of. The mindset that we have always had is like thinking about sort of, there's a scene in the Indiana Jones movie where he's basically trying to swap the skull for like a bag of sand. And so he's trying to grab it off the pedestal and swap in the bag of sand and not set off any booby traps. And that's sort of like what the first couple of years of our product development were like, was like, how do you build the software to do everything that the old school operators do, exactly how they do it, almost to the point that like an owner will not notice the difference. And so we can just sell to them as if we are any old generic parking company, and they don't really realize like the technology behind the scenes, but they don't really care either, right? They just want to know that they're going to get the result. And then the last few years has been, okay, now that we have built that foundation, how do you build these really interesting things on top of that you can only build if you've built that data and technology foundation, which is dynamic pricing, license plate reading, cameras at the entrance, the exit, real-time tracking of vehicles that are moving out throughout the parking facility, all of which has to be built on top of this sort of walled garden technology approach. So it was less of I wish it was more of a strategic, like we absolutely knew at the time that if we wanted to be building the products that we want to build today, 5 years on, that we chose that strategically, that route. But it was more like we just kept trying to outsource things, and every time we tried to outsource things, it never went well for us. And so we just had to do it ourselves to make our customers happy.
Yeah, totally. It's very much the Thanos, I'll just do it myself attitude, where it's like, I'm just continuously disappointed by what's out there. And it's interesting too, because probably you lived through firsthand the sort of empathetic experience with your customers, where it's like, man, if we're this frustrated, imagine the people whose ability to turn a profit off of this thing is dependent on these things. Like that's pretty complicated. The next piece of this is like, so you step back and you think about the business model you guys have built, and you kind of, if you think about it in simplest terms, you think about sort of, price times quantity. There's a bunch of questions you can start to ask there. Number one, what are the revenue streams? What are you charging for? Obviously, you have a lot of different technology. You're offering management services. You're booting cars and shoveling, the walks and stuff. So you have this sort of, there's lots of things you could charge for. And then the other interesting part of that equation is the quantity is sort of complex too, right? Where in my mind, I go back to this thing we talked about where even in these sort of quote unquote SMB vertical SaaS businesses, you can have very different, very local little garage in some random city, all the way to like, I'd imagine like, I don't know, the parking structures in Vegas or in the casinos or whatever it is. So there's a lot of different surface area. And then even within a parking garage, it's like, is it spaces? Is it people? Is it, locations, whatever. So how do you think about those equations? What are you building and focusing revenue on and charging for? And where are you sort of prioritizing in terms of the quantity side?
Yeah, I think that what's really interesting about parking from like a pricing standpoint is that parking actually in this way it's like a disposable good. Like it sort of, you don't really think about it, but like it goes bad, right? In the sense that like parking is a space and that space has like a time component attached to it. And so if we don't fill a parking space for a certain amount of time, you've actually lost revenue that could have been there, right? It's like, if you think about it, not in terms of parking, but if you think about it in terms of like an apartment building, like how does an apartment building owner think about their revenue and their revenue potential? They think about, I have 10 units, I can lease them out for $100 per month per unit. I could be making $1,000 per month. Anytime that a unit is sitting empty, totally. I have a cost that is that vacancy cost, right? And the same thing goes for parking. Exactly. And I think that that's one of the interesting questions in parking generally is that as a consumer, anytime you show up to a parking facility and you have to pay for parking, it's the bane of your existence, right? And why is that? It's because it doesn't feel when you're parking as a consumer, it doesn't feel like there's actually any immediate direct cost to what you're buying. And so any parking rate feels absurd because you're like, well, there's this space and it's sitting empty and it's going to quote unquote go bad if nobody uses it. So I should just be able to use it for free. And so it becomes like this really interesting supply demand sort of standoff in terms of parking. And, there's actually been a lot of interesting research done here in the last 30 or 40 years by this professor named Donald Shoup, who is kind of like this, he has started this zeitgeist around parking and like how parking should be charged for in America and how parking being free in America is actually what is one of the big sources of like misused land and things like that. And, we're not necessarily super involved in that research necessarily, except in as much as like we're doing real-time dynamic pricing that nobody else is doing. His research is mostly on like the on-street stuff, but the off-street stuff is what we manage. And it's where there's a lot of interesting data that we can pull and learn from because we can run experiments in real time with consumers where you pull into a facility and there's 5, different groups that we're putting you into. And so 5 different consumers pulling into 5 different groups in that same facility will actually be shown 5 different rates. And then we can see based on those rates, like how did you react? Like, did you see that rate and then want to leave, or did you not come back, or did you violate instead of paying? What was your rating at the end of the session? Did you long-term retain the same? And like, that's the first time that anybody's really doing that sort of sophisticated pricing, which is, the same thing like an airline or a hotel industry does very normally, but nobody's really done that in parking. And so that's all kind of bakes back into the philosophy that we have, where I think you sort of asked about our business model here as well, which is that we just operate on a revenue share with owners. And so we want to be really transparent for owners. We don't want to have misaligned incentives. And so what we do with them is we do a revenue share on the gross revenue of the facility. So say it's like a 70-30, they get 70%, we get 30%, and our 30% goes toward covering all the operating costs of the facility. And so our incentive then becomes, how do we make as much money for the facility as possible? Because that's how we maximize our share of that revenue. And then how do we basically automate and drive down costs while also still maintaining a good driver experience and everything like that, so that then our gross margin is as good as possible. And so we've always taken that sort of incentive alignment mindset to this, because then that also drives us wanting to do dynamic pricing and wanting to have the best technology, because that increases our pie or increases our gross margin on our share of the pie. And so I think that incentive alignment from the very get-go drives a lot of decision making later on from the company.
So how do you then, and then so to take that and you translate that into, all right, here's where we want to focus, which I love the incentives piece, by the way. Like there's so many business models that are sort of inherent in, I actually don't want the best outcome for you. I want the best outcome for me. And sometimes it's sort of that principal agent problem that seems like you guys have really solved. And so then how does that translate into traction, and what are you most focused on? Obviously, there's easy sort of just top-line revenue. So you could say our top-line revenue is X, and we feel really good about that. It could be number of spaces managed, number of locations, whatever. How do you quantify traction, and what are the North Star metrics that you're focused on?
Yeah, we mostly track GMV, so that's technically gross merchandise value, which is like, the classic sort of marketplace metric. We mostly think of it as like gross marketplace volume, even that's not technically what the acronym stands for.
Sure.
But we mostly track our GMV and then our take rate as a percentage of that GMV, and then like what our gross margin is on that take rate, right? Because when I'm thinking about our business, what I care about at the end of the day is how much money is the sort of operating business of our parking lots spitting off to cover our overhead expenses, because that's how we eventually become a profitable and very large self-sustaining company. And I think that also when I'm thinking about how we pitch ourselves to investors, I usually like to sort of surprise them for the better, where usually the way I'm describing it is like, hey, this is how much GMV we're processing. And then naturally their next follow-up question is like, oh, but what's your take rate on that GMV? Our standard is like 30%, our blended is like 25 something percent. And usually they're like, oh, that's a lot higher than I expected, because a lot of marketplaces are a lot lower than that because they're not adding as much value to the sort of thing that they're transacting in, whereas we're sort of actively managing these properties, right? And then they naturally ask about our gross margin, like, what is your gross margin on that? And usually when I tell them, they're like, oh, that's higher than I expected. And ultimately what I care about is like that gross margin on the take rate, because that gross margin winds up being sort of our equivalent to like a SaaS revenue figure. So it's like, if we're making $10 million of take rate, cool, but what's your gross margin on that? Because all that matters is the sort of pure profit, like money that's being spit off by the business, because that's more like, that's what we've earned as more of like a SaaS fee after the operating expenses. So after we've paid for snow plowing, after we've paid for sweeping, whatever gross margin or gross profit is left over, that's what we care about as a company from in terms of economic viability. But GMV is mostly the North Star that we track to see how much money is flowing through us, because different parking lots obviously vary in size. We have parking lots that do $50 a month in GMV, and we have parking lots that do $250,000 a month in GMV, and it is a whole gamut of things in between.
Yeah. So where are you guys at today, whether it is GMV or number of locations, number of states you're in, whatever you think about, but where are you guys at today?
Yeah, we manage about 250 properties across 35 or 36 states now. So we're across most of the United States, but actually the funny thing is that we've been across most of the United States for a couple of years now. So that's not necessarily news. We just took very much took the approach from the beginning that if you want to build this business and scale as quickly as we want to scale, you have to be willing to operate a property anywhere and everywhere. So we have properties in pretty much every major metro area at this point, and we also have properties in places as small as towns of like 14,000 people in West Virginia, and we have to make it work no matter how much is around us and no matter where we are. So we're very much nationwide, but operate about 250 properties today.
Yeah. It's such an interesting model that you have, and I love the way you articulate it and thinking about like where is the actual like value capture that's happening in our business. So many people are so focused on like we're creating a ton of value, and it's like great, but if nobody will pay you for creating that value, that's not a great business. And it makes me think about sort of in the e-commerce world, there's sort of a paradigm or a spectrum, right? You kind of think of like a Etsy on one hand and a Shopify on the other, where it's sort of a very simple Shopify software product where it's like, hey, we will set you up and then you're on your own, like Godspeed. Hopefully you have a good brand and good marketing and customer acquisition and whatever. And as a result, they have sort of single digit percentage take rates. Whereas you have an Etsy, which, and again, very different business scale, everything. But Etsy is providing much more value, at least in the sense of like what is capturable value for Etsy, because they are bringing users right to your store that may never have found you independent of that sort of demand creation. And so for you guys, the value, it seems, is more so on, we're actually, like to your point at the very beginning, we're getting our hands dirty. We are running parking lots themselves. And as a result, we know how to build the best technology for that. And that's why we can capture the most value. Are there any concerns if you step back from that and you think about, where maybe what keeps you up at night, right? That model is operationally complex, I would imagine. Are there breaking points? Are there sort of difficulties with scaling that? Like, what are the things that make it the sort of weight of gravity on a business model like that?
Yeah, I think that, it's an interesting question. And to your point about like capturing value, I think that one of the most common things that, at least in the early days, investors would compare us against was like, oh, I've used like Park Mobile or, Pay by Phone or Spot Hero or whatever it happens to be, one of these just pure software payment apps to pay for parking before. And generally speaking, those are effectively just like they're a wrapper on like Stripe,
Sure.
right? And at the end of the day, they only charge like basically marginal points, percentage points above what sort of payment processing rates are, because at the end of the day, they're not adding them that much value and they're very interchangeable, right? So it's definitely a question of like, how do you capture value, not just create the value, or create the value and capture it ideally. But yeah, I mean, as far as, challenges for the business, I think that one of the things that's always been, interesting to us is just like, how do you scale effectively and, do it with as few people as possible. So, I mean, right now, AirGarage's operations team is, I think, 6 full-time people. And that compares with like, oftentimes some of these old school parking companies, they will have 6 operations employees just in one parking garage or just in one city. And so we're very, very, very lean from an operations standpoint. And that, both is created by the fact that we've built technology from the get-go, but then also forces us to build more technology. So a big push in the last quarter for us has been, how do we build some new products that will take a lot of the work off the operations team and things like that. I think that, scaling from that point of view, though, I'm not too worried about, because a lot of the services that we provide on a daily basis they're outsourced to third-party vendors, right? And we basically get to benefit from the fact that there's market competition for those third-party services. So if one of our vendors is dropping the ball in New Orleans, doing sweeping in parking lots, like we'll call all the other vendors in New Orleans that manage parking lots. And so what that means is that our operations team winds up looking a lot more like a thought partner or an asset manager for the owner, instead of just like, oh, we just need to get stuff done, rote day to day. Like we need to go sweep and clean and, count the accounting and stuff like that. So it's like that technology automation allows us to spend a lot more time thinking about the asset management side of thing, how to be a good partner, how to be proactive for the owner. And so I think that's probably where I spend the most time thinking about, on the like scaling side, is like, how do we continue to enable that in the future? And maybe it's some like crazy thing about like, oh, we pull in so much data from the parking lots and parking garages, and then we're able to sort of do this like AI driven like asset management and, basically be the most proactive parking company, because we're constantly, that quote unquote AI asset manager is constantly watching the data feed that's coming in, constantly watching the transactions, the average order value, the dynamic pricing reports, all this sort of stuff, and seeing, how is this affecting the total GMV that this property is doing, and making suggestions to owners. And so basically the question is like, how do you scale up that sort of asset management and partnership mindset as we continue to grow and not get sucked back down into the like just day-to-day operations? It's a constant balance, obviously, to scale effectively in that way.
Crazy. And so if I understand that correctly, it's basically you got what you mentioned, 250 locations, 6 operations managers. And so that is basically 6 people managing 250 locations with, it sounds like, a combination of every location having sort of third-party service providers. But when it comes to the like full-time folks that you have making sure these properties are running on time, it really comes down to those 6 people running a massive network of coordination. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, that's crazy. Talk about leverage, right? Just the ability to be able to build a model that gives you that leverage. I mean, if you were to go out and say, hey, let's just start a parking management company, it's like you couldn't do that with 6 people, because you have to be juggling these nightmare pieces of technology that are constantly letting you down. And so you have to be putting out all those fires. And so you need, maybe 100 plus people to manage 250 locations, because you have no leverage from the system. But for you guys, it's sort of that perfect hand in hand, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's like you benefit a lot, especially over time, from optimizing that operations process. And like, honestly, half the time it's like when we're building software with ourselves as the customer. It's like, how do we build software to make our operations team more effective, to make our sales team more effective, so that then like we can be a better partner, a better manager for the owners that we're working with, right? It's like sometimes the software we're building is for the owners, sometimes the software we're building is for consumers, sometimes it's for us. And the engineers and the operations people sitting in the same room, sitting under the same roof in the same company makes a world of a difference for that, because I was talking to a startup recently, and they basically were building a product that they wanted to be able to drop into our payment flow as like an experimental thing. And it was interesting because the founder basically was suggesting that like, hey, I had a conversation with some of the other old school parking companies, and they were all really excited about being able to do this. But when it came down to it, they realized that they don't control their payment flow, and so they couldn't actually do this experiment. They had no way to insert this sort of technology or new code into the payment flow. Meanwhile, AirGarage, we just spent like 6 months rebuilding our payment flow from the ground up to be like 2.5 times faster, just because we know that the more drivers, the easier it is, the more drivers pay, the more money we make. Because of that incentive alignment, it drives us to be like, hey, how do we keep expanding the pie? How do we make sure that people are paying as much as possible? As high of a frequency or capture rate as possible, and how do we drive down costs and everything like that. And so all of that like incentive alignment flows back into us just constantly questioning every premise and saying, how do we build the best technology to be the best operators, to be as efficient as possible, because it flows back to our owners. And it's kind of the same philosophy that Sam Walton of Walmart talked about a lot. It's like every dollar that we spend or that we save either gets charged to or gets saved by our customers. And like that's our mindset as well, is like everything we can do to make more money for the parking lot or drive down costs benefits our owners. And so we're going to continue to do that, because what benefits our owners benefits AirGarage.
It's such a good ambition too, in terms of our main, if our main focus is on making our customers more money, ultimately because of the incentive system you've lined up, you're going to make more money, and it could be a much bigger business. Stepping back to like where you are today and the ambition for where you want to go, right? So you've got 250 locations, maybe that represents millions in GMV. What is the capacity you can go to? Is there a certain number of locations you have in the back of your mind where you think, man, I know that there's X number of locations out there. If we can get 1,000 of them, 3,000 of them, whatever, and that would represent X, millions of dollars of revenue, we a public company, whatever. How do you think about quantifying the ambition that you have for what AirGarage can become?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's, a really interesting question, because we think about this a lot. And, sort of by our rough math, one of the other interesting things about the parking market is just nobody has really built data sets around the parking market or real estate or quantified it in any meaningful way in the past. People have made attempts to, but it's all sort of in different places and locked up behind doors and stuff like that. And so one of the most interesting things we've tried to do over the last year is, in order to enable our go-to-market machine to keep going at the rate that we want it to, we have to pump a ton of data into it. And so we have to build basically this map of every parking facility in America, whether it be a parking lot or a parking garage or free parking or paid parking. And we're trying to create this map. And so, our rough estimate is that there's somewhere in the range of like 60 to 80,000 parking lots in the United States, right? And so like that's pretty big, but assume very conservatively that like only 50% of them are actually owned by like private entities that actually want to charge for paid parking and stuff like that. So maybe there's like 30 to 40,000 parking lots we can go after. Even still, it's like that's a pretty large market for us to be going after, considering we only have 250 properties. And I don't know the number off the top of my head, but of those 250 properties, you can imagine there's actually only a small handful that actually produce the majority of our GMV. And so it's like, round it down to say there's 100 properties that we actually care about in our portfolio of 250, maybe just to be really conservative. It's like the market is still, 400 times larger than us, I guess would be the quick math on that. Or maybe it'd be 4,000 times. I can't actually do that math. I hate doing public math on podcasts. But anyway, it's 40,000 parking lots we can go after. We have 100 of them, say. So it's like there's a lot of room for us to grow. And like, I mean, if you think in general about, we raised a Series A in 2021 from Andreessen Horowitz. If you think about in general, like what is an investor looking for in a Series B? They're generally looking for, do you have a predictable, repeatable sort of go-to-market motion, which is what we've been focused on building. And then they're looking at, say, hey, you're about $10 million of annualized revenue right now. Do we think that in the reasonable time frame of about 3 years, you could take this from being a $10 million a year company to a $100 million a year company? And then like, could you raise your next round or go public or whatever it happens to be? And I think that given the size of the market and how small we are and how advanced our technology is relative to competitors, I'm like really excited about where we can go in the next few years. And our growth has only been sort of accelerating each year for the past few years. So should be a good time, going after the rest of this market. And I hope that, our competition is at least a little bit scared of us.
That's right. It's exciting. Well, and it's a good segue because I think like final question for you as I reflect on the things that you're describing, what I see is a really interesting approach to building technology for a specific vertical. And I think there's a lot to be learned. Again, like I mentioned, other companies that have taken on completely different verticals have taken very different approaches, but it really feels like a combination of the becoming vertically integrated and then building a sort of end-to-end solution, both on the technology and the services side, can be really powerful in a lot of these sort of real world verticals, these things we talked about at the beginning where it sort of make the world go round. And so as you step back and think about what you've learned thus far, how you've built the product, how it feels like that set you up for success, or maybe the mistakes that you've made that you could have scaled faster or whatever, right? If you were talking to a founder who wanted to build in a similar way, maybe a totally different vertical, maybe it's elevators, right? They want to go tackle the elevator tech stack and things. What advice would you give? What's the best lesson you've learned from tackling a vertical like this?
Yeah, I think first of all, please do. I wish there was more founders working on problems like this. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot in the last 6 months is, as AI becomes, more commonplace and it becomes cheaper and cheaper to develop software, pure software, is there any defensibility in any product or any software that is pure software that doesn't have some physical world component, or do all of the margins get driven out of that just by, software being developed really cheaply by AI? And solo developers? It's a really interesting question to me. And so I'm like, this is the perfect time to be going after physical world businesses and trying to look at businesses that have, been around for 50 or 100 years and still do things very manually, very offline, very old school. There's so many of them out there, and most of them you don't even notice day to day, just like parking companies. I'm naming parking companies at the beginning of this podcast. You probably have never heard of them, or if you have heard of them, it's only because you were mad at one of them one time because they gave you a ticket because you didn't pay, something like that, right? It's like nobody thinks about these, and I think there's a lot of industries out there like this. And so I think the biggest thing is like go out there and like just try to sell the service to the customer to start with, and then like start building the technology as you sort of fly the airplane, right? I mean, we signed our first contract to take over our first parking lot May 15th of 2018. We took over that parking lot June 1st of 2018. So literally in the span of like 2 or 3 weeks, my co-founder Scott and Chelsea needed to build all of the technology that sort of underpins what we do today in like 2 weeks, because we hadn't built it before. It didn't exist. We sort of sold this church on the concept, and they didn't know that the technology didn't really exist. That's how we got started, and that's how we've always built, is by just signing up the first customer and then figuring out exactly what they need and building the software for them, and then just iterating from there over many years, and you wind up with something relatively significant after a while.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great advice too, right? Just in terms of, it's a very sort of don't spend so much time thinking about the approach and the difficulties and all these different hoops you're going to have to jump through eventually. It's get into the weeds and understand the problem, force yourself to solve the problem. And even it sounds like another key takeaway you've touched on a few times is align yourself to the problem, right? Don't just try and solve the problem for somebody else, but make the problem your problem, and then your solutions are going to be much better because you're trying to figure out how to run a parking garage the best way you can, and your technology needs to reflect that. So I love that lesson.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We sign a contract and they're expecting us to make them money by the end of the month. And now we have to figure out at the end of the month, how are we going to make sure that we have money to pay them?
That's right. I love that. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for walking me through the details. It's super fun to just think about how to tackle these real world problems, and excited to continue to get to watch you guys take over the parking world and make my life a lot more convenient every time I have to park.
Yeah, hopefully we can do exactly that.
All right. Thanks so much. Take care.